Hello and welcome to the Halcyon podcast. My name's Leonides. I'm going to be your host of this episode. This is going to be coming out a few days after it's even remotely relevant to talk about this subject, but I'm nothing if not consistent in covering things way after they become even remotely topical. I want to talk about the Serena Williams situation. For those of you who don't know, a few days ago, Serena Williams was competing in the final of the US Open, during the course of which it was alleged that she was receiving on the court coaching from one of her coach members, if not her head coach, for which she was warned apparently, but then she was warned again, and in the ensuing chaos, it's fair to say she confronted the umpire directly, accosted him, made a couple of pretty bold statements that have come back to be quoted on numerous times in outlets and tweets and things of that nature since. That has been quite controversial to say the least. It's also come out a few days after that, or in fact the day after that, that an Australian cartoonist decided to use the opportunity to either willingly or unwillingly stir the pot to a certain degree by releasing a cartoon image depicting Serena Williams in some kind of, she obviously clearly frustrated and angry, jumping on a tennis racket, with the umpire in the background addressing the competitor saying, "Can you let her win, or would you just let her win?" The contention there being how Serena Williams was depicted being somewhat of the 1930s, 1940s black caricature, i.e. a racist depiction of her in a discerning light, to say the least. So there's a couple of things to take away from this. And the reason why I thought it was interesting to talk about is this. It seems to me that at the moment there are two camps evolving out of this. People who are on the side of Williams, in the sense that they feel that she was unfairly treated and a victim of sexism, if not sexism and racism, and people that think that the cartoon was overtly racist and offensive, or people that agree that the umpire was correct in his assessment, and that the people that thought that the cartoonist was simply exercising his right to free speech. So let's break it down. So it's if you want to break down the initial situation with the tennis umpire, from what I have seen, and it's worth pointing out at this point, this is where my opinion is probably going to be undermined to a large degree. I didn't see the match. I saw the result, and I saw some of the news outlets that came afterwards. I've scoured the internet to try and find as much footage as possible, but considering it's a copyrighted event, and because it was in America, it means that it's not easy to get a hold of footage that is not sort of second hand or edited, or it's difficult to verify the source material. So the footage that I've seen shows a moment where the coach is in the crowd and is looking at Serena and using several hand gestures. This is picked up by the cameras. So at that point, it cuts back to Serena Williams because she's in the midst of her argument. Okay, sorry, that's just a comment from someone else that I'll just need to address later on. So where was I? Yes. She was already in the midst of having her argument with the umpire. And the umpire had, from the footage, is seeming to be quite respectful. But Serena Williams is clearly being very aggressive. She uses the rationale that she's a mother now and she stands for what's right for her daughter, that he owes her an apology, that he's a thief, and this, that, and the other. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm in the minority here, but when it comes to sport, specifically at the elite level, I hate football for this, and this is where the sporting thing comes into play, and this is where people can tune out for a second. This isn't a social issue, but football in particular has such a piss poor track record for respecting authority. Managers are now temporary leaders of a dressing room. They hold very little authority in the long term and all the authority in the short term, with no assistance or backup from anybody else in the short term. Referees are in a whole world of... They have so many problems in trying to control people on the pitch. There's so many times where a player will do something dissent and then expect no response. And then when they get yellow carded for it, or they get told off for it, they say, don't do it again, or yellow card you, and then they do it again, they get yellow carded. They're almost surprised that because they're acting like children, and because they're acting in such a manner that's not befitting of a man, and it's football. I don't see it so much in the female game, I have to say. Of the few games that I've seen women play, typically speaking, they hold the standard way better than men do. Maybe it's just because the culture of men's football has evolved down this route, and women, if given enough time, would. Maybe women just have a bit of a better respect for authority, excluding this case from Serena Williams. I don't know. I'd have to look into it more thoroughly to make that assessment more fully. But from the limited evidence that you have at hand, it's very easy to see that the male side of football is tremendously disrespectful to any member of authority. Tremendously. Every linesman gets abuse, every referee gets abuse, and yet you need them for the game. If you didn't have a referee in charge and you didn't respect their authority to a certain degree, you'd have players kicking the living shit out of everybody else, players picking up the ball and running down the pitch with it, throwing it into the goal, handballs are plenty, elbows are plenty, offsides constantly, all this other jazz. You need a referee in order to keep the game. Now, I feel that the reason for this is because that there's no incentive in the game of football to respect referees on a football pitch. You can't mic them up because footballers have mouths that you couldn't broadcast a lot of the shit that they say. You can't have a situation where a ref is constantly just sending off players for dissent because you'd have no games going. It comes back down to the grassroots level of football, teaching respect. It's why Sunday leagues have such a problem with their football, because a lot of times the referees there are subject to a lot of abuse, not necessarily from the players themselves, albeit, yeah, that's Sunday league specifically, yes, that's a bad case. But kids football, it's bad. You see referees constantly all the time getting shit for bad calls and things like that, which is, they're just doing it, it's their job. They're there to make their judgment call. You have to respect that authority. And bringing it back to the case of Serena Williams for a second, the way she was addressing the umpire, I thought was out of order. Now, the counter argument to that was, well, hang on a second, this is a double standard. Men do this all the time. Well, in that sense, I agree. Men shouldn't be pulling this kind of bollocks either. But does that excuse her? No. If she's being held to a double standard, it has to be substantiated with, give me a like-for-like situation now, not 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I've seen the McEnroe excuse where it was, you saw him smashing his rackets and shouting at the umpire. Yeah, I agree. That's a really piss-poor exhibit of how not to conduct yourself in elite sport. He should have really, for that level of dissent, it should have cost him the game. That level of disrespect, but I've seen that sort of shit in football all the time. So it's not hard for me to understand why. Serena Williams, I understand her frustration, but unfortunately the evidence is to the contrary. You've seen footage of her being guided by her coach. The umpire has seen the same thing and he's warned her on it. You can't get in the referee's face for making a call like that because that's what he's there to do. Now, as far as the backlash is concerned, I feel that he was justified in his decision based on what I've seen, but I haven't seen the full extent. The argument against it, which was, well, Serena Williams is being held to a higher standard than men would have been in that situation. I have this to say. If that's the case, that is BS. And that's a big if, though. I don't know of many other famous instances of men getting that aggressive with an umpire, and if I saw it, I'd have to know what the backlash was, because I have to believe that consistency has to be the rule here. If the players were getting a face, but they were consistently being punished to the same extent that Williams was, albeit Williams has to understand and has to appreciate that if she wants to accept the moniker of being a role model to women and her daughter and yada yada yada, and have all the focal attention, that means the hammer has to come down harder on her by just the fact that she has bigger notoriety, which means that if she is seen to get away with it, it will trickle down. That's why I use the football analogy, because in football, you see players at an elite level doing this shit all the fucking time. And it trickles down to even the point where even kids matches, 5-6-year-olds, the referees are being hurled abuse at, and no one respects the referee. People dive, people cheat all the time. There's no respect for the authority. Whereas in rugby, this never happens. In rugby, and it's my favourite sport for this, in fact American football as well, if I was to draw the comparison, American football for my American counterparts, there is almost never dissension towards a referee directly. There's the occasional brawl, there's the occasional coach that gets misty-eyed and annoyed at the situation, might throw the red flag and yada yada yada. Players, I've seen players, because unfortunately you can't be that hyped and not get in a referee's face from time to time, but it's usually punished quite quickly. 5-yard penalty, 10-yard penalty, 15-yard penalty, unsportsmanlike contact. They have things for this that have immediate impacts on the team, so the incentive is never to do that because it's more productive to just get on with the game. In this case though, I feel the umpire was justified in exerting his authority based on what I've seen. But what's more interesting to me is that the cascade of boos that occurred afterwards, because it was perceived at that point that Williams had been robbed of the final, when she hadn't. She was losing. The fact of the matter is, she was losing the match. And it's equally reasonable to assume that she was frustrated about losing to the point where she was going to look for an excuse. Now, is that right or wrong to assume? I don't know. I just know that I've been in similar situations where you're losing and you're frustrated and you're looking for any excuse, you throw tantrums from time to time. It's a perfectly reasonable and human response in that situation to try and find a way of shifting the odds back in your favour. But just call it what it is. Just call it being a sportsman. Don't call it, well, I'm now a victim and I'm being shouted down, because I don't see any evidence to that effect there. I see evidence that the coach was giving coaching, which again, the argument there then becomes, well, that they should be allowed coaching. There shouldn't be any reason why a player shouldn't receive coaching on the court. Well, again, having very little to no context about tennis, I don't know how much of an advantage it is player to player, which coaches are better at it doing it on the court, and therefore how much money you have giving you the advantage rather than just your technical ability. I don't know. But if everyone agrees, if all the tennis players agree and all of the coaches and all the umpires agree, yeah, we're more than happy to let coaching go on in a competitive match, then fine. But unfortunately, if it's against the rules, then it's against the rules. You can't argue against that. You can't be annoyed that you've been penalised for doing something wrong. That's just counterproductive to what the sport is about. Which leads me on to the cartoonist issue, and this is where it gets a little murkier, because it's a very, very subjective piece of drawing, I have to say. I looked at it, and I've got to be honest, it's not a flattering depiction of Serena Williams by any stretch of the imagination. It's not meant to be. The Aussie cartoonist is an Aussie cartoonist, and this is where I'll make a generalisation here. Aussies really don't get that offended very often. So it's difficult to offend them, and it's also sometimes quite difficult to explain to them why they may have caused offence. I know this because I've fucking been there. And there are times where I'll hear someone say something and I'll go, it's a bit out of order, don't you think? And I'll get the response of, yeah, well, I don't think so. Why do you think so? And you have to sort of explain it to them step by step as to why someone might perceive what they were saying as being offensive to a degree. I think what's interesting about that is that the Aussie cartoonist has, largely speaking, been attacked for the insinuation that he's being racist and the connotation of it being like a 1940s cartoon. Now, I've seen some of the comparisons that have been made. I don't necessarily see a direct correlation. I think people are reading a bit too much into that based on cartoons that I've seen in the UK, for instance, where they typically portray British politicians in certain situations because they're angling for a one-hit punchline. That's where it's all directed. There's a focal point of the cartoon, and it's very, very rarely more than 2 layers deep. And the reason for that is because you have to get it while you're reading a newspaper. So in this situation, I don't necessarily think that the criticism is unwarranted because the cartoon perhaps trivializes a point that's worth looking into. I think if Serena Williams feels that she has been completely Tennis this is interesting. So there's apparently a news story running around saying some umpires are considering boycotting Serena Williams' matches. Now that would be interesting, because I would class that as discrimination. This is one instance where the frustration got the better of her, and she's being punished for it. That should be the due punishment. I don't see why then boycotting her matches seems to be a reasonable or a commensurate level of response, because that would be going way too far if you ask me. I think if you punish her for that infraction, that should be it. But as far as the cartoon is concerned, going off topic a little bit there, as far as the cartoon is concerned, I mean, see it for yourself. I've retweeted it, I think, once or twice, but if I don't, I'll retweet it at the time this podcast gets uploaded so people can have a look for themselves. But I've got to be honest, I don't see the cartoon as racist. I see some of the points that some of the people that are offended by the cartoon make. The depiction of her is not flattering in the slightest, but I don't see anything overtly racist about the cartoon. What I see is a trivialization of a situation that, in pure sportsman terms, I think was justified. She should have been penalised based on the information that I've seen. And she has been fined as a result, I believe. And I imagine she'll probably appeal the fine, and this will rumble on for a while yet. But her actions and her response were that, I have to be honest, when I saw it, I was thinking that was much like a petulant child. Especially to use I have a daughter and therefore I stand up for what's right for her. Well, that's got fuck all to do with the tennis match you're in the middle of. And it's also got fuck all to do with the fact that your coach is gesturing at you. And I'm sorry, you've got no control over that. If that's what you're really mad at, have a word with him. He should be the one that you're mad at, because you're saying, why are you gesturing to me? You know you can't do that. The cartoonist, I believe, has made a point there of trying to accentuate the fact that he feels that she was going mental because she was losing. And she was trying to find any excuse to get out of that situation. That's debatable, because her intentions could have been clear. She might not have seen the gesturing. That's all fair. That's all well and good. I'm not questioning her intentions there. I am questioning her will to win as a sportsman, because the problem I have, and this is a point I was going to make on another podcast, but I'll relate it to this, is when you have elite level sportsmen who are serial winners, I don't know if there are any really good ones out there, and I'll quantify what I mean by that. I think that in order to reach a pinnacle, a level of success and stay there, it's almost impossible for you to do that with there being there has to be some favoritism, there has to be some preferential treatment, there has to be something that keeps you there. No pure talent stays on top forever and ever, like Serena Williams, like Lionel Messi, like Michael Jordan, like Michael Schumacher for a time, Tiger Woods. All of these dominant sportsmen have something in their repertoire that other competitors don't, and it ain't just talent or skill. I'm a firm believer of this, and I'll quantify this at some stage, but the best reason I give for this is someone like Hulk Hogan, for instance, in the WWE. Now, the response back to that immediately is, well, it's wrestling, it's fake, it's predominant. No. You can't dismiss it, because in order to stay in a position of power in wrestling, you have to be able to leverage political power over responses from the crowd, performances versus opportunities. And that's where elite level sportsmen come into. That's where they build their notoriety, that's where they build their legend, that's where they build their myth. Serena Williams and Venus Williams are both immensely popular sportsmen because, yes, of their talent, but of the amount of times that they've appeared in prominent positions and seemingly won. It's the reason why Ronda Rousey was considered as powerful as she is. It's the reason why Conor McGregor is as powerful as he is. But in combat sports, as opposed to competitive sports, it's much easier to highlight, well, actually, no, these people aren't supermen. And it's very easy why. All it takes is a minute. All it takes is one bad performance in a combat sport to highlight the flaws in someone's game. In tennis, rugby, football, other sports, it's much more difficult to highlight a specific downturn, because you can have a bad performance. You can drop out of a tennis tournament. You can lose a football match. In WWE, you can occasionally have a stinker of a match. but it doesn't necessarily affect your legacy, but so long as you make sure that you're in the position at the back end of things to determine the course of events of history. The point I'm making in a long-winded way of this is that the response of, I'm in the right here, I represent what's good, so you shouldn't be penalising me, is not really a great excuse for my money, because that somehow, that's her leveraging her position and her authority over the referee, and I don't like that. I never like the idea that a sports person consider themselves above the sport to the point where they're dictating terms to the referees. I hate that. It happens all the fucking time in football. In the WWE it happens sometimes, not always now, where performers are dictating to management how they think things should go, rather than management saying, well, no, this is what's best for the business that made you and that's making you all this money. In football, it happens all the time in terms of transfers. There's not a single transfer window that goes by where someone isn't leveraging their power over a club. And to a degree, you could argue that it's about time. Clubs have had the majority of the power for a long time. It's about time players had to say, well, yes, but that's when things get stupid. And that's when the sport starts to not be able to sustain itself. Some of the football transfers, for some of my American counterparts, some of the football transfers are astronomical sums of money these days. Comparative to even 4 years ago, they're astronomical. Player that would have been considered amazing, world-class, unbelievable, was £50 million, or the equivalent of about $70 million a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. Now a world-class player will set you back between 150 to 200 million pounds if you're serious about getting a world-class player in. And that's just because of a couple of transfers from people that use their power to leverage themselves in positions that they would then exploit for better deals for themselves, for their agents, for better merchandising rights, for marketing deals and things of that nature. It's a bad trend. And this in a microcosm is why I'm struggling to side with Serena Williams and people that are offended by the cartoon, because I look at the cartoon and I don't necessarily agree that it's racist. I understand that it's offensive to people that were particularly agree with Serena Williams' decision. I agree that perhaps it's unflattering because it was meant to be. And like I say, the Aussies don't really have a deft perception of satire that we do. That's why if you take Aussie Man, for instance, or Jim Jeffries as examples of two Australian comedians that are fairly prominent now, two different mediums, but still, their comedy is one of they don't give a shit. They're in the middle of talking and they just kind of go, fucking this and fucking that and blah, 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 and yeah, fucking this and fucking that. And that's a generalization in of itself, but I would think most Australians would probably look at that and go, yeah, it's a generalization, you're welcome to it, but I don't necessarily agree, and I think you're full of shit, but let's have a beer and let's talk this out. They'd have a very benevolent way of talking about it, which is why I respect the Aussies, because they seem to have that graft of conversation where they're perfectly willing to discuss anything, so long as you don't get too worked up about it. The second you get worked up, they're a bit, calm down. It's not really worth getting annoyed about this. So, having made a massive generalization about the Aussies, and having made a potentially very bold statement about the cartoon, and the fact that the cartoon is being reprinted on the front page of the newspaper that printed it in the first place is a bold move. I will give them props for that, because in the face of pressure to probably have that cartoonist fired, if not remove that cartoon from circulation, to reprint it on the front page, I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad idea. From the perspective of free speech and creative control, I'm all for it. I love it because I've looked at it and I don't see it as a racist statement. From the perspective of what's good for your magazine, though, I think that's probably not a great idea, because what you're doing is fighting fire with fire. And this is why it keeps coming back to my argument of sustained anger will wear out in the face of a good argument. And I feel like in this case, the argument is Serena Williams benefited from coaching, indirectly or directly. She was penalised, she reacted badly, she was penalised again, and then mocked in a cartoon which depicts her unfavourably. That's kind of about it. But the outrage seems to be spinning more and more about the fact that, and it all comes back down to the fact that there's a debutante, 20-year-old winner of the US Open, and I don't even know her name, because my research hasn't led, that's not really the relevant issue here. Serena Williams, even in defeat, seems to have taken all of the spotlight off of a competitor. And that's sad. It's really, really not great. Because I think that when you... Really, really not great. That's a really, really strong statement. But anyway, point being is that it's a tennis match. She lost. This should be a moment for the sport of tennis to celebrate by saying, here's the passing of the torch from one great to a potential great. A 20-year-old who now has the opportunity to try and take this win, this exceptional performance, and run with it. But as far as the cartoon is concerned, I just don't see the racism there, and I don't see how the fact that he's attempted to exploit the unfavourable light should be cause for concern. It's a very, very tricky one, and I think what boiled my blood on this is seeing her react so fervently to a referee doing his job. And whenever I see sports people doing that, there's a time and a place for it, and it sure as fuck isn't in the middle of a court or a pitch when they still have a job to do. They still have authority over the situation that they have to observe and they have to respect. And when they don't, it undermines the sport. It sets a bad example. And just because you, in this case, again, I'm speaking out of term here. I'm going to speak out of term because of the phrasing that she used. If you consider yourself to be some kind of social activist, or someone standing up for good and is someone who is of great moral standing, then display that fact in the midst of it, not in the heat of battle. Sorry, let me clarify that. When there's a game going on, you can't accuse someone of cheating or being a thief without substantiating it, when she can't. And I think that the situation has spun out of control because of who it is. If someone else had made these flippant comments, the umpire would have said, this is ridiculous, da-da-da. You can see, unfortunately, the fear in his eyes because he knows what kind of power she wields in the sport. It's a tricky situation. I'd be interested to see, and I'd be interested to hear what people think about this in particular. I'd be interested to see what people think about the result, what her reaction was in response to being called out for apparently cheating, and I'd be interested to see what people think about the cartoon, whether they think it's racist, whether or not they think it's not, if it is, why it is, if it's caused you any offense, how you think Serena Williams has handled the situation, and more importantly, because I don't think the umpire should be left out of this now, because having an equally pessimistic and quite frankly petulant response by saying, well, I don't think any of us want to referee our matches anymore if we're just going to get called out every time for doing our jobs. Well, not a great response. You're paid to do it, so man up and just fucking do it. So the referees don't escape criticism here, because again, if I bring it back to the rugby referees for a second, I forget the Welshman's name, but I'll never forget this image of him bringing in two massive behemoths of muscle, bringing them in, pulling them close. He's a good 1.5 foot shorter than both of them, pulling them in and saying, right, I'm telling you both now, you pack it in. You tell your players, they pack it in, you tell yours. If I have to pull you back in here, there's going to be trouble. And both of the players fuck off, go and speak to their respective teams and go, lads, can you pack it the fuck in, alright? I'm going to get in serious trouble in a minute if you don't pack this fuck in. Legitimately respectful of the referee, and I want to see that more and more if I can, but if sportsmen are allowed to wield their power like this, it's difficult to see how we can move forward with it. So what do you think? Serena Williams, do you think she was unjustly criticised? Do you think she's been held to a double standard? Do you think that she deserves this level of criticism? Do you think that the punishment was warranted? Do you think the referee acted instinctively or in a concerted effort to undermine her? Do you think the cartoon was racist? Do you think it wasn't racist? Do you think it unfairly depicted her? Do you think it was funny? Do you think reprinting it was a bad idea? What do you think? I want to hear what your thoughts are on this matter. So please, Thank you very much for listening to this edition of the Halcyon podcast. Please like, share and subscribe. Check out some of the other content creators in the description below. I want to hear what your comments and thoughts are in the comments, so I want to see your questions, I want to see your thoughts play out, and I'll be happy to debate you on any of this. If you want to appear on the podcast, hit me up. I'd be more than happy to carry on this discussion or a wider discussion whenever it is suitable. Thank you very much for listening. Please, as always, take care of yourselves. I've been your host, Lorne Risley, and I'll see you on the next edition of the Halcyon podcast.